In this section of the class, we're going to be talking about tax prorations. When you close a transaction, no matter what day of the year that you're closing, the taxes probably haven't been dealt with for both parties yet. So for example, right now at the time I'm filming this, we're in May. And so if you're closing in May, the seller hasn't paid the taxes for this year yet, simply because the tax bills haven't gone out yet. There's no way that the seller could have paid taxes. So what the attorney does at closing is they try to make it fair in regards to the taxes. We're not trying to get the tax man paid. We're just trying to make it fair between the two parties, the buyer and the seller. So what the attorney looks at, first of all, is the contract. Our contract says this. Our contract says that taxes are prorated on a calendar year basis. A calendar year, of course, is going to be January 1st to December 30th. Okay. Now notice I said to December 30th. As you're doing your math in this section of the book, what's going to happen is every month is going to have 30 days. There'll be 12 months with 30 days, so there'll be 360 days in a year, what we call a banker's year. And that's the way we're going to do the math problems in here. So let's take an example of it. As I'm recording this, it is May something, let's call it May 13th. Okay? So if we were closing on May 13th, what the attorney would look at is whether the taxes have been paid this year or not. Well, here's what you guys need to remember from your previous work in this class, is that the tax bills don't go out until after July and the taxes are due September 1st. So for the taxes for this year, they have not been paid yet. There's no way that they could have been paid for this calendar year, okay? So the attorney's gonna make it fair. I'm gonna make this number up, but let's say that the taxes for the year are $720. I just made that up. Sometimes we'll make you solve for it, sometimes we'll give it to you. Well, if the taxes are $720 per year, does this make sense to you? That if there are 360 days a year, the taxes are $2 per day. Okay, so it sounds like we just found the first step, or it could be our second step, depending on the way you solve this. But I now know that since my taxes are $720 for the year, they're $2 per day. So every day that the seller has owned that house and not paid the taxes this year, he owes $2. So now my next step, and you could do these in either order, but my next step is to figure out how many days the seller has owned the property. Well, be careful right here, because the seller has actually owned it 4 months at 30 days, which is 120 days plus 13 days in May. So the seller has owned that property 133 days at $2 per day for a total of $266. Now remember, at the closing table, we don't deal with dollar bills. We deal with credits and debits. So in this particular case, the seller needs to give the buyer $266 because the buyer is going to own the home on September 1st when the taxes come due. So the seller will, in essence, have paid his part to the buyer. So the way this will look on the test is that this would be a debit to the seller for $266 and a credit to the buyer for $266. Whatever we take out of the seller's pocket, we have to give to the buyer, okay? So that's one example. Now, as you learn this, what you're going to understand is this is an example of what happens if the closing takes place prior to September 1st. Let's take a look at what would happen if the closing were to take place after September 1st. We'll step aside for just a second so you can see that. Okay. Let's change everything just so that you don't confuse the problems. Okay, in this case, I'm going to say that the taxes for the year are $1,080. Again, I just made that number up so we'd have something to work with. Taxes for the year are $1,080. I'm going to tell you, and the question will tell you, that these taxes have been paid. Taxes are $1,080 for the year, and they have been paid. In other words, September 1st passed, and the seller paid those taxes. And our closing is taking place on October 22nd, okay? So our closing is taking place on October 22nd, given in the problem. I just made that up, but it's given in the problem, okay? We're telling you that the taxes have been paid, And so now we have to think in our mind, well, what's going to happen in this case? Well, in this case, what's going to happen is the seller paid for the whole year, but the seller didn't live there the whole year. He only lived there till 10/22. So what would make it fair? Well, how about if the buyer paid him for the part of the year that he's going to live in? So I'm going to look at the taxes. The taxes are $1,080 for the year. My first step is always to divide by 360. If I did my math right, that's $3 per day. Okay, taxes are $3 per day, just like we did in the original problem. But this time, the taxes have been paid. So the buyer is, in essence, going to reimburse the seller for those taxes that they had paid in advance. So let's see, we have all of all of December, which is 30 days. We have all of November, which is 30 days. And then we have 30 minus 22. We have 8 days in, what would that be, October. So 30 plus 8 is 68 days. And 68 days times $3 per day equals whatever that comes out to be. It looks like it's about $204. $204. 24. Yeah, that looks right. Okay, so 240 is this length of time. Now remember, the parties are not handing out $1 bills. They're handing out debits and credits. So at the closing table, who is the attorney going to take that $204 from? Well, he's going to debit the buyer for that period of time that the buyer is going to use the property. He's going to debit the buyer $204. He's going to take that money, and he's going to credit it to the seller, $204. Why? Because it's kind of like a reimbursement. The seller's getting paid for those taxes that he had already taken care of this year and didn't live there for that period of time. I want you to notice a couple of things. Notice how easy it was for me the first step to figure out how much the taxes were per day. That's going to be consistent. The next thing I need to look for is whether the taxes have been paid. Now, did you notice this? When the closing took place in May, I didn't tell you whether the taxes have been paid or not, because you're to understand that the taxes could not have been paid because the tax bill is not even going out yet. If it closes before September 1st, we won't tell you whether the taxes have been paid. After September 1st, we have to tell you whether the taxes have been paid or not. Okay, how much was the daily rate? We figured out in this case that the buyer needs to pay for the part of the year he's going to use. He's going to give that money. We're going to take it from the buyer. We're going to give it to the seller. I would also like you to notice the consistency on this. What we're taking from the buyer has to be the exact same amount that we give to the seller, okay? So you're starting to see some clues pop up in here. We'll see some examples of this in just a moment. But let me give you one more scenario. There is one more scenario. Unless you're reading ahead, this is probably the first time that you've seen this. So let me tell you, there are actually 3 scenarios. What you'll find out about this math is it's not the math that's hard. We're just simply dividing by 360 and figuring out the numbers of days. That's not hard. The hard part is to figure out which type applies. Were the taxes paid? Was it after September 1st and the taxes were paid? Or is it after September 1st and the taxes are unpaid? Remember, before September 1st, the taxes are always going to be unpaid. But think about this for just a second. What if we have a transaction? What if we have transaction that closes on, let's make it a different day just so we don't confuse it, 11/3. So it's closing on November 3rd. And the taxes haven't been paid yet. And you say, well, how could something like that happen? Well, let me remind you, taxes are due on September 1st, right? But remember, you're not penalized until like January 6th or something like that. So the fact of the matter is a lot of people reach 11/3 and they haven't paid their taxes yet. So let me tell you, in the test question, we have to give you this type of information. First of all, let's go back to, let's say the taxes this time are $14.40. $14.40, just so happens that divided by 360 is $4 per day. It'll never work out quite this simple on the test. We'll probably make you work a little bit harder than that. But in this case, the taxes are $4 per day. Does that make sense? If the taxes are $14.40 for the year, okay? In this class, in this example, I'm telling you that they are unpaid. These taxes are unpaid. Why? Because we said so in the problem. That's why, right? So here's what the attorney does in this case. He doesn't want there to be any liens on the property. So the attorney doesn't take any chances in this case. He says, you know what? The taxes are unpaid. So, hey, seller, how about you bring your part of the year, and buyer, you bring your part of the year. The attorney collects both, and then the attorney pays the tax office. That way they know that it's taken care of. I want you to listen again to what I just said. The attorney is going to take from the seller and from the buyer. They're going to take a lot from the seller, a little from the buyer. It's going to be a double debit. So as I'm starting to do my thinking on this, I know it's going to be a debit buyer, debit seller. Why? Because the attorney's taken from both, and the attorney's going to pay the tax office himself. So now here's what we know. By the way, when I end it with this one, I always solve the buyer side first. Watch what I do here. In this case, I know that the buyer is responsible for 30 days in December, and 30 minus 3 would be 27 in November. I'm going to rewrite it here so that you can see. 30 plus 27 equals 57 days. And 57 days times $4 per day. Oh gosh, that looks like it's going to be $228. Check my math on that, but I believe that that's correct. Now, the reason I always do the buyers first is in this scenario, if I know how much the buyer paid, I can simply subtract that from what is totally owed. And that'll tell us what the seller has to pay. So 1440 minus 228, looks like that's going to be 1212. And you could of course add those together to make sure that that comes out. But it's going to be a debit to the buyer of $228, debit to the seller of $1,212. This is going to show up on the settlement statement, a debit in both columns. The attorney will take and pay the tax office from there, and now they don't have to worry anymore about the taxes this year. So here's some good news for you. The good news on this is, look, the math's not hard. The 3 scenarios, that's what you're practicing on, and you'll have some homework on this so that you can get better and sharp on this. And hopefully you'll see this as a math problem, but it'll be one that you'll be excited to see.